Hello, my name is Samuel Clark. I use he, him pronouns. Thank you for your time today, and thank you to the Center for Undergraduate Research for hosting this conference. I'm excited to share part of my undergraduate psychology honors project with you. I've completed this project thanks to Nicolette Zangari, who collected the data for her dissertation, and also thanks to Dr. Charlene Muhlenhard, who has been a wonderful advisor. Without further ado, are some sexual orientation labels more permanent? This study seeks to add to the lacking literature on sexual fluidity. A psych info search for sexual fluidity publications in the past decade only returns 800 results, while bisexual returns more than 14,000. Even Mock and iBox 2012 paper, which had a similar topic, only examined the fluidity of heterosexuality, homosexuality, and bisexuality. What about other orientations and their labels? The data for the present study was collected by Nicolette Zangari as part of her PhD dissertation on how people choose their sexual orientation labels. Participants were asked open-ended questions about their gender and sexual identity, which we grouped into categories. Nicolette intentionally oversampled gender and sexual minorities by posting the recruitment information on social media pages centered on LGBT topics. There were 424 participants, and on the right, you can see how many participants were in each sexual orientation label group. Here are the survey items we analyzed for this presentation. All questions were open-ended. For the last question, participants gave us an open-ended answer and we coded their answers as yes, unsure, tentative no, or no. For this presentation on my honors project, we seek to answer the following questions. Do participants perceive their current sexual orientation label as permanent? Does this vary by gender identity label? And does this vary by sexual orientation label? We asked participants, do you think of your current sexual orientation label as permanent? The responses were open-ended, which we coded into these 5 categories. Just over half of participants' responses indicated that they thought their label was permanent. We analyzed participants' codes for permanency by the gender identity label they endorsed to construct this graph. Red indicates that participants see their label as permanent, and green indicates that participants believe it is not permanent. Only gender identities with more than 10 participants were included on this graph. Their answers seemed fairly consistent across gender identity labels. However, the story changed when we sorted the answers on permanency by their sexual orientation label. Only sexual orientation labels with more than 10 participants were included on this graph. The least permanent label is on the left and the most permanent label is on the right. What could be behind these differences? One advantage of qualitative data is that participants were able to explain their answers. So let's take a look at some participants' answers. We'll proceed from the least permanent labels to the most permanent. For each sexual orientation label, we'll read a few examples for each label. We tried to include examples of participants who both did and did not see their label as permanent. First off, we'll look at answers from participants who identified as queer. First off, no, my labels have changed through the years and often change in the present. Acceptance of labels change, and I will continue to assess and identify with the community that makes most sense for me. Our next queer participant says, yes, I'm pretty well figured out at this point, and if things change, queer will still be a big enough umbrella for me to fit under. Like the second participant, many mentioned their label as permanent because it was broad enough to encompass any changes in their orientation. This is odd because people in this sexual orientation label group were least likely to see their label as permanent. On to demisexual, our second least permanent label category. Our first participant writes, the label is a descriptor applied to summate my feelings and experiences, and as those feelings and experiences are subject to fluidity and change over time, so is the label. Our second participant writes, yes, because I felt this way all my life and couldn't really put a label to what it was until recently. Pansexual was our third least permanent label category. Our first participant wrote, sort of. I spent a ton of time in cis-het culture, so it could be more an issue of overexposure to one group I found attractive eclipsed my other attractions. Our second participant writes, no, because I am always growing and changing, and there are new ways to express ourselves every day. Some participants endorsed multiple labels. Our first multiple label participant endorsed both pansexual and bisexual. They wrote, "Yes, I've always been attracted to all genders. I'm 40. I can't imagine how that would change. Some people become more open to other genders over time. I am already open to all." Our second multiple label participant has given a longer, more elaborate response to their sexual orientation label. They wrote, "Nah, life is change. We all change." Bisexual was our middle category for permanence of label. The first participant writes, "Labels can always shift because the meanings of words can always change. A term may arise that I feel describes him better, so I may adopt that." Our second participant writes, "Yep, even if I end up with a woman, I'll still be attracted to non-binary people and feminine men." Asexual was our fourth most permanent label group. Our first participant writes, "Kind of. I do think this describes me pretty well, but I have discovered stuff about myself before. It's permanent until proven differently." Our next participant said, "Yes, I'm pretty confident in my experiences, and I don't think I'll just suddenly experience emotions I never have. To me, that's like expecting to see a new primary color that's never existed for you." Thirdly, not necessarily. I'm very much open to changing the label if it turns out not to be accurate or adding to it as necessary. I would prefer the label to be correct than something locked in. Our third most permanent category is straight. Our first participant said, "Yes, I believe that for me it is permanent. I have never really deviated from my heterosexuality. I'm confident in my own preference and attraction." Our second participant said, "No, because I feel that if I met the right person, it wouldn't matter the gender. My right person just happened to be a man." Gay was the second most permanent category. Our first participant wrote, "Mostly, but should I end up in a relationship with a woman, I'd probably begin identifying generically as queer, because parsing out my sexuality any further than that would probably get confusing." With this participant, we again see the trend of using queer to avoid the nitty-gritty of labeling complex identities. The second participant writes, "I've been gay since I was 6 years old. Almost 5 decades later, it doesn't seem like it's changing anytime soon." Finally, our most permanent sexual orientation group was lesbian. First participant writes, "I can't see it changing at this time, but acknowledge that sexuality can be fluid." Our second participant said, "Yes, I hated being with men, and I will never be in a relationship with a man again." Our third lesbian participant said, "Yes, I'm with my one. We're both female, so I don't see that changing. If I wasn't with her, I would still be attracted to women, so..." However, she also reported to being attracted to Angelina Jolie. Now that we've seen some participants' responses, here again is the figure of permanency of labels sorted by sexual orientation label. It displays the labels from least permanent on the left to most permanent on the right. We see that many labels that have more recently entered the public vernacular are perceived as less permanent. Initially, I thought this may be because of some relationship to age of those who endorse the label, so we decided to take a look at the mean age of each orientation label group. What we found was interesting. We ranked each label from 1 to 9 on the permanency of the label and the mean age of the group. There was a trend of labels with high perceived permanency also having a higher mean age. Specifically, lesbian ranked highest in permanency and age, but one group broke this trend. Our asexual label group ranked fourth in permanency, but was the youngest group by far. Here's the data from the previous table, perceived permanency by the mean age. We can see here that asexual is a strong outlier. Here are the takeaways from what we found. 78% of participants described seeing their label as permanent or probably permanent. This was not a nationally representative sample, as participants were recruited from the LGBT-focused websites, so we are not claiming that 78% of all people see their label as permanent. Labels such as queer, pansexual, and demisexual are broad. They can be used by individuals of any gender who are attracted to individuals of any gender. We might expect that most individuals who use such broad labels would regard them as permanent because the term can accommodate fluidity in their attraction or orientation, but this was not the case overall. In fact, fewer than half of participants who identified as queer, pansexual, or demisexual saw their label as permanent. Every participant who identified as lesbian saw it as permanent or probably permanent. What might explain this pattern? Participants identifying as lesbian were the oldest group with an average age of 37. Some mentioned that they had had a chance to explore their sexuality, and lesbian was the best fit. Additionally, lesbian is used only by women who are attracted to women. One might identify as lesbian only if all of these attributes match their orientation. In contrast, younger participants might still be in the process of exploring. For instance, labels such as queer, pansexual, and demisexual have become common more recently. Individuals using these labels might have adopted them recently and are of a younger age generally, and thus they might be open to adopting a different new label in the future. Overall, the higher the mean age of a sexual orientation group, the more likely they were to see their label as permanent. The asexual participants countered this trend, being the youngest group, yet ranked 4th out of 9 in perceived permanence. If you want to contact anyone who's worked on this project, we've all got some pretty easy email addresses to remember. Thank you for your time and attention, and enjoy the conference.